Recently, China has combined two practices to make significant political and territorial gains in Asia without crossing the threshold into open conflict with the United States. First, since the 1990s, China has focused on low-cost ways to disrupt, disable, and deny U.S. ability to operate in the region, instead of trying to compete directly with U.S. power projection capabilities. China's ballistic and cruise missiles, for example, hurt the U.S. ability to come to the aid of Japan, Taiwan, or the Philippines in the case of a conflict with China. Second, since 2009, instead of direct confrontation to push the United States out of the Asia-Pacific, China has engaged in activities below the threshold of conflict. For example, China has increased the risk to the United States of operating in the South China Sea by harassing U.S. vessels and aircraft with non-military platforms to maintain a degree of deniability and discourage a counter-response. As a result, China has gained more power and territorial control in Asia without recourse. Do you think the United States should push back more against China? Let us know in our poll. Also, let us know what other topics you'd like our scholars to cover in 60 seconds. And be sure to like and subscribe for more research and videos from AEI.
Numerous times in the last 5 years, Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro has crushed pro-democracy demonstrations. However, Venezuelans who are taking to the streets now to reclaim their freedom from a narco-dictatorship may finally have a fighting chance. The United States and much of the international community are backing Juan Guaidó as the legitimate president of Venezuela. Democracies in the region have a great deal at stake in ensuring a turnaround in Venezuela. They should warn Maduro of dire consequences if he uses violence against Guaidó or other innocent civilians. They should also recognize Guaidó's authority on all economic and diplomatic decisions. The region and the United States should deliver humanitarian assistance the moment President Guaidó and the National Assembly authorize such operations on Venezuelan territory. If there is a murderous crackdown against demonstrators, these governments must be prepared to protect human life from the regime. Venezuela's friends must continue to act boldly to defend economic and political freedom in that country.
People in the United States still want to be part of the American dream story of success. But what actually is the American dream, and is it still attainable? Traditionally, the dream has been associated with a successful career, wealth, and home ownership. Popular conceptions of the American dream also focus on the ability to achieve more success than one's parents, causing some to believe that the opportunity to realize the dream is declining. Yet, the results of the AEI survey on community and society suggest something different. Significantly more people believe that the freedom to live their lives as they choose and the ability to have fulfilling family lives are more essential to the dream than home ownership, wealth, and having a better quality of life than their parents. We found that about 8 in 10 Americans believe that they are living the dream or are on their way to achieving it, and only 16% of people say that becoming wealthy is essential to the American dream. This is good news for Americans today. Our results show that people still believe that family and community matter, and that the majority of Americans believe that the American dream is in their reach.
In this populist moment, conservatives should champion anew their basic values, principles, and priorities, and the economic policies that flow from them. These commitments advance a particular vision of society in which free markets reward individual initiative, public policy advances opportunity, and energy and dynamism characterize our economic lives. It's a society that demands personal responsibility, self-reliance, and self-discipline, but also recognizes human imperfection and uncertainty, and therefore allows no one to fall too far. And it's a society in which mediating institutions, most especially the family, are strong and vibrant. Specifically, conservatives should not retreat from their long-held policy views on the importance of economic growth, free trade, entitlement reform, and friendliness to immigrants. But conservatives should also update their agenda to address low rates of workforce participation, sluggish wage growth, a healthcare sector in need of reform, failing schools, and much more. Conservatives should remember that limited, energetic government has a positive role to play in a properly ordered society, empowering individuals to earn their own success, to realize their potential, and lead lives of dignity.
Ready? In 1923, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk founded Turkey from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. His goal was to reorient society toward the West. He abolished the caliphate, reformed the legal code, and changed the alphabet. He gave women equal rights and embraced the separation of mosque and state. For decades, the West took Turkey for granted. Turkey was a NATO member and stood firm against communism, terrorism, and Islamism. Turkey was among the first Muslim countries to have a female prime minister. It aspired to EU membership. As a secular democracy, it stood in contrast to most Muslim-majority countries. Recep Tayyip Erdogan changed this. He declared his goal to raise a religious generation. Over 14 years, he curtailed free press and opposition. He Islamized curricula and pushed women from the public sphere. He is the anti-Ataturk. Islam is ascendant. Secularists have been cowed into silence. But is Turkey's change permanent? Some hope that when Erdogan goes, the old Turkey will return. That's wishful thinking. Erdogan has brainwashed a generation, purged the military, and reshaped bureaucracy. Plus, the opposition is incompetent. The good old days are gone. With or without Erdogan, Turkey's going to be a problem for decades to come. "14 years of Erdoganism has transformed Turkey from ally to adversary. What does this mean for the United States? NATO is at risk. The defensive alliance is run by consensus, so a single objection paralyzes it. There is no mechanism to expel wayward members. Even if Erdogan doesn't seek NATO's destruction, Turkey is an intelligence risk. Integrating Russian S-400 missiles would mean exposing NATO secrets to the Kremlin. It gets worse. In fits of pique, Erdogan exposed Israeli spies to Iran and later leaked the location of American forces inside Syria to the Islamic State. What comes next could be even worse. Hakan Fidan, Turkey's intelligence chief, favors Tehran and Moscow over Washington. Turkey is currently a partner on the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, America's next-generation aircraft. Should the Pentagon really trust Turkey not to share the F-35 stealth technology with Russia, Iran, and China? Don't even get me started on Turkey's terror sponsorship. What to do? It's time to stop pretending Turkey is an ally. The best policies are geared to reality, not the fantasy of how things used to be.
On January 9th, North and South Korea engaged in high-level talks for the first time in 2 years. Instead of addressing North Korea's nuclear program, the two sides discussed less contentious issues, such as North Korea's participation in the upcoming Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang. While dialogue can reduce unnecessary tension and even serve as a way to gather more information about North Korea's perspectives and strategy, there could be drawbacks if Washington and Seoul are not careful. First, North Korea's willingness to talk about minor issues is not an indicator that Pyongyang's position on nuclear weapons is softening. There is no situation under which North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons through negotiations. Second, Kim might be trying to improve relations with Seoul as a way of driving a wedge in the US-ROK alliance. And there's a risk of this, given that the United States prefers a strategy of escalating pressure, whereas South Korea prioritizes maximum engagement. Now, more than ever, the United States and South Korea must continue to coordinate their approach towards North Korea.
Following another choice tweet in a new tell-all book, a group of psychiatrists are publicly warning, now more than ever, that the president is dangerous and urging that he be removed from access to weapons. These psychiatrists are expressing a view that millions of Americans share and millions reject, and claiming that their expertise as mental health professionals adds authority. But does it? As a psychiatrist, I say no. They have no greater insight into Trump's behavior and thus his fitness for office. When they claim to, they politicize our profession. His grandiosity and impulsivity were evident during the campaign and earlier. They're his baseline features. Had his personality undergone rapid deterioration, affected his ability to govern, then the cabinet and Congress would likely ask psychiatrists for a diagnosis, treatment options, and a prognosis in the course of invoking the 25th Amendment to deprive him of his powers. But ultimately, this is a political process, not a medical one. Whatever one thinks of Mr. Trump, his actions and words are on display for all to see. The public doesn't need experts to interpret them.
What do polls tell us about sexual harassment? When women are asked whether they have ever experienced harassment, polls give us responses ranging from a low of 42% in one poll to a high of 60% in another. Fewer, around 30% of women in recent polls, say that they have been sexually harassed at work. There is positive news in a new survey. A large majority think their workplaces take the issue very seriously. That's important because around 2/3 believe that recent allegations against high-profile men indicate a widespread problem in society and not isolated incidences. For the most part, men and women agree on what constitutes harassment, though in most cases men are less likely to call a behavior harassment than women are. Lewd, aggressive, or threatening behavior is clearly seen as harassment, flirtatious actions less so. When an issue catches fire like this one has, it's important to take care in interpreting early poll results, but the polls released thus far present a fairly consistent picture of attitudes about harassment.
If you own cryptocurrency, or a coin, you control some numbers on a ledger that's stored on computers all across the world. The ledger contains all the transactions that have ever occurred for that cryptocurrency. You control your coin through a wallet, which is really just software used to engage in transactions. You control your wallet through a private key, a code, that is required to transfer coin from your wallet. Your wallet also has a public key that people use to send coin to you. What keeps someone from changing the ledger and stealing your coin? A technology called blockchain. Blockchain incorporates the existing ledger into a code called a hash. If someone tries to steal coin, the hash changes and all the computers that store the ledger cry foul. In fact, every time you engage in a transaction, these computers, called miners, verify the transaction by solving a complex mathematical puzzle that involves the hash. The computer that does this the fastest is rewarded with coin, which keeps the system financially viable.
Over the past generation, tremendous productivity growth has allowed the U.S. dairy farms and processors to become globally competitive. However, despite this growth, outdated policies that are counterproductive to the dairy economy remain in place. Such policies include the 80-year-old Orwellian federal milk marketing orders, a concoction of convoluted U.S. pricing regulations, the selectively protectionist import barriers that suited the old, inefficient U.S. milk industry, and lastly, the recent subsidized margin insurance scheme, which offers periodic payments designed to be highly favorable to small, inefficient farms. This program may become costly, harms lower-cost farms, and adds little to risk management. These programs may benefit some farms and processors, often the least productive, but do so at the expense of taxpayers, consumers, and the broad dairy industry. It is now time to let the U.S. milk producers and processors embrace their global competitiveness and innovate unencumbered by obsolete policy approaches.
Good news! In 2016, poverty in the United States, no matter how you measured it, fell close to its all-time low, with especially good numbers for African Americans and Hispanics. But with more than 40 million Americans still qualifying for food stamp benefits, we surely can do better. The problem is a shrinking labor force. Unemployment is low, but many healthy people, especially men, have dropped out of the labor force entirely and rely on the social safety net for support. If you're healthy and you choose not to work, there's only so much the government can do to keep you out of poverty. Thankfully, 2018 should be a good year for people to get into work and out of poverty. Employers are hiring, paying more, even hiring people returning from prison, and offering paid leave packages and enhanced training. Safety net programs like food stamps are beginning to focus on pushing people into work, not just signing them up for benefits. These efforts mean even more people will earn their way out of poverty in 2018. And if you're truly focused on enhancing dignity for all Americans, that's what matters most.
A college student recently asked me whether students should invest in Bitcoin. I said I don't give investment advice, but I cautioned her, be careful what you mean by invest. You see, cryptocurrencies or coins aren't like stocks that give you rights to a company. With most coins, all you own is the right to transfer it to someone else. She said, that sounds like traditional currencies. So why does Bitcoin fluctuate in value so much? With traditional currencies, when people want to do more transactions or save more, the amount of the currency grows, if governments are doing their job. So the value stays about the same. Not so with cryptocurrencies. Their supply is driven by software, which generally creates new coin at a fixed pace, regardless of the demand for the coin. So whenever people want more, whether for transactions or to speculate for future values, or just because they're enthusiastic about coin, the value grows. When people want less, the value drops. It's all about demand. So with cryptocurrencies, know what you own. Countries around the world are struggling with what to do about cryptocurrencies. Some countries want to encourage them, others want to control them, and others want them to just go away. What are the concerns? Well, the UK worries about price volatility and criminal use. US regulators are talking about fraud, unregulated activities, and price bubbles. What appears to underlie the push for regulation is a fear that cryptocurrencies cannot be easily controlled, that they may have impacts that we can't foresee. The fears are well-founded. Cryptocurrencies are really just lines of computer code that can be as variable as coders' imaginations, and those pieces of code are spread across computers around the world. Yet, this is the future of digital markets. People will be engaging in economic relationships that are varied and ever-changing. This is a difficult future for government regulatory systems. They're used to regulating things like bank accounts and stocks, where specialized rules and organizations can be set up. Cryptocurrencies could disrupt this historical approach to regulation.
All right, you guys ready? Agency fees, which are the fees non-members are forced to pay unions for representation in some states, and the abode precedent that allows them could both be scrapped when the Supreme Court hears Janus versus AFSCME. So why the fight over agency fees? Unions call these fees fair share fees because everybody covered by a union negotiated contract has to pay for representation. The fees are typically 2/3 of full membership dues, and they aren't supposed to support unions' political activities, balancing freedom of expression with the need to prevent free riders. The petitioner, Janus, argues that agency fees infringe on freedoms of speech and association, claiming it's impossible to separate unions' political and non-political functions when union bargaining with the government is inherently political. For Janus, it's not about the money, it's about compelled speech. Stare decisis is a legal principle that makes overturning precedents rare, but many court watchers, including unions, expect the conservative justices will overturn abode. Whether the court decides agency fees are an appropriate balance or compelled speech will have a major influence on the future of America's unions. Unions will take a major blow in the upcoming Janus versus AFSCME case if the Supreme Court rules that agency fees are unconstitutional. Agency fees, which some states require non-union employees to pay unions for representation, have been a linchpin of union membership. Take the NEA, America's largest teachers union. The 22 states with agency fees are home to 69% of NEA members. Agency fees are pivotal because they change the cost of union membership. Take California. Teachers can pay $1,000 to join the union, or not join, but still pay $650 in agency fees. With no fees, teachers choose to pay $1,000 or zero. As the cost of joining soars, union membership will fall. No one knows by how much, but since 2010, 3 states dropped agency fees, and in them, the NEA shrank between 17 and 59%. A defeat in Janus will weaken America's most powerful education interest groups. The long-term question is, by how much?
The Chinese Communist Party recently proposed a constitutional amendment to abolish term limits on the presidency. This change would allow the current president to remain in power after his second term elapses in 2023. The bottom line is that President Xi's extended tenure will likely lead to more repression at home and more assertiveness abroad. Domestically, he's rooted out his political enemies through a broad-sweeping anti-corruption campaign. Moreover, the core of Xi Jinping thought, now enshrined in the Chinese constitution, is that the party controls everything. Xi is not a reformer. Freedom of information and expression have already been reduced under his rule, and we can expect this to continue. While greater repression won't be popular with the Chinese people, greater international assertiveness likely will be. Judging by China's involvement in various economic and military initiatives, Xi is comfortable with pursuing power and influence abroad. He's also initiated the deepest military reforms in China's history, and once those are complete, China may move to blatant use of force to achieve, in Xi's words, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
There you go.
President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty had some important successes, but it got at least one thing very wrong. Its leaders used the language of civil rights to talk about income and poverty. Financial assistance from the government is not a right. It's not protected by the Constitution like religious freedom or freedom of speech. Using the language of rights led to two big mistakes. First, it told people in need that they had no role in improving their economic situation. The government would take care of everything. And second, it led to a misguided effort to use Congress and federal courts to impose uniform anti-poverty policies on every state. Helping people struggling with poverty doesn't work that way. Individual responsibility plays a role. It's not always sufficient, but it is essential. And federal mandates often mean decision makers are too far removed from what is happening in cities and states. Our anti-poverty programs work best when we insist on some effort by those seeking assistance, and we allow states to devise the best approaches.
After the 2016 election, some school choice advocates hoped for a huge federal choice initiative, but the last 2 decades of federal K-12 policy demonstrate why that might not be so wise. Big, bold Washington reforms can misunderstand the important differences between communities, generate bulky, clumsy programs, and as a result, engender resentment among local stakeholders. So choice advocates might thank Uncle Sam for his interest, but ask him to step back. For 25 years, states and locals have led on school choice, and to great effect. Today, 3 million children attend charters, and another 500,000 are using the various private school choice programs. This has been built on a humbler approach to policymaking than swift certain DC initiatives. It elevates parents, local nonprofits, and state leaders, those who know their communities inside and out, and who will have to live with the consequences of their decisions. Yes, they might move more slowly at first and make course corrections along the way, but the result can be smart, tailored programs that have deep local support. We should continue to trust federalism and localism when it comes to school choice.
Ethanol has been a matter of intense debate and lobbying for decades, thanks to the government support it enjoys. Currently, the Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS, requires refiners to blend ethanol into their gasoline. This drives up prices at the pump, but also at the grocery store because it diverts cropland from food production to fuel production. Ranchers complain about the effect on feed prices. Environmentalists object to ethanol's effect on groundwater and greenhouse gas emissions. But the ethanol industry is politically strong thanks to the clout of farmers in Iowa's first-in-the-nation caucuses. In early 2018, a refiner in Philadelphia filed for bankruptcy, blaming the ethanol mandate. The ethanol industry has pushed back on the Trump administration's plans to weaken the RFS. Congress could end it and force ethanol to compete in the free market by passing legislation to wind down the RFS over 5 years, and some lawmakers have proposed a bill to do just that. If this passed, it would mean cleaner groundwater, cheaper gasoline, and cheaper food.
In early March, West Virginia's teachers ended a 9-day strike after the legislature adopted a 5% boost in teacher pay. Missing from the headlines was much attention to how West Virginia got here. West Virginia added staff while losing students. Over more than 2 decades, West Virginia's student enrollment fell by 12%, but non-teaching staff grew by 10%. In fact, between 1992 and 2014, real per pupil spending rose 39%, but real teacher pay actually fell 3%. Consider this: a West Virginia teacher would today earn more than $63,000 a year if teacher pay had simply kept pace with per pupil spending. Salaries are only part of the story, of course. West Virginia ranks in the top 5 nationally in terms of retirement costs. That comes at the expense of take-home pay. Look, take-home pay for West Virginia's teachers is pretty dismal, and this 5% bump certainly helps. But this settlement is a costly patch that didn't address a frustrating status quo.
Barriers to 5G wireless networks are regulatory, not technical. While the FCC is taking steps to modernize existing deployment regulations, most regulatory decisions about 5G will be made at the local level. In California, San Jose and Sacramento have taken vastly different approaches to 5G. San Jose sees 5G rollout as rent extraction, charging carriers $3,500 annually to access each of its street poles. Sacramento, on the other hand, is a model city that has already launched its pilot 5G program. It has 100 cell sites, expanded backhaul, an expedited permitting process, and free Wi-Fi in 27 parks. Soon, Sacramento will experience wireless gigabit internet, speeds that were previously only available via fiber. Such forward-looking cities recognize that private investment improves operational efficiency, lowers costs, and increases quality of life. Cities can reduce barriers to entry and facilitate competition and choice. To stay ahead, American leaders at all levels need to streamline the rollout of 5G.
I think I need to lose a little weight. President Trump just announced tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese goods, and half the planet seems to be screaming about a trade war. Neither the administration nor its critics are right because the tariffs will actually have little impact. The administration is right that China coerces U.S. companies into transferring technology and steals other intellectual property outright. They are also right that the WTO has failed to prevent this and U.S. action is overdue. But the 25% tariff on $50 billion will only cut imports from China by about $20 billion. Imports from China rose twice that much in 2017. We won't even notice these tariffs. For that reason, China doesn't have much reason to act on its own to retaliate. They will certainly threaten to do so, in part to scare other countries from copying the U.S. But they need trade with the U.S. more than the U.S. needs trade with China. So it's in China's interest for this dispute to stay limited. Right now, this is a tempest in a teapot. But eventually, people are going to notice that very little has actually changed. And that eventually may coincide with the start of the 2020 presidential election campaign. We're not done with this yet.
For a decade, Washington, D.C. has been a celebrated national model of school reform. Then, in January, an audit showed that 1/3 of D.C.'s high school graduates should not have received diplomas. Indeed, it turns out that the system's true graduation rate is lower than it was in 2011. How could this have gone unnoticed? Blogger Alexander Russo has placed part of the blame on rank boosterism by the Capitol's preeminent news outlet. But this coverage reflects a larger problem: the bandwagon mentality in school reform. Since 2007, philanthropists have poured more than $120 million into DC schools, and advocates and think tanks were lauded for glowing accounts of developments in DC. It was easy for reformers to feel they'd be labeled unhelpful or anti-reform for going off script. This all fueled a with us or against us mindset in which no one looked too hard for problems. DC should be a wake-up call for a school reform culture that has been heavy on cheerleading and light on skepticism.
Conservatives should care about the 2020 decennial census. For one, it's mandated in the U.S. Constitution, and right up top. Fidelity to the Constitution implies fidelity to a fair and accurate census. In addition, the census is critical to American business. The best way for a free market to work efficiently and fairly is for businesses of every size to have access to accurate information to help them make critical decisions. If conservatives want businesses to make the best decisions possible, they should want a fair and accurate census. A major threat to the accuracy of the census is underfunding. Why? Due to rhetoric coming from Washington, members of some immigrant and minority communities have already shown concern about answering census questions. The Commerce Secretary's unfortunate decision to include a citizenship question makes matters worse. The more reluctant people are to answer the survey, the more money census will have to spend to get their answers. In addition, Census is employing new technologies for the 2020 count that will save taxpayers money in the long run, but those technologies need to be tested and protected against threats. An accurate census is in all our interests. Congress needs to step up.
America's schools have been caught up in a testing mania for, well, most of the 21st century. It's long past time that we focused on a healthier vision of good schooling, not just reading and math, but also character, responsibility, good citizenship. The push for social and emotional learning, or SEL, can help with all of this. That's why I was pleased to see the influential Aspen Institute recently release a consensus report from its national panel on SEL. I was less pleased to see that the consensus was mostly banalities, and downright disappointed to see it filled with the ideological gobbledygook of education school progressivism. Talk of character and personal responsibility was conspicuous in its absence. We all want schools to be more focused on character and all the needs of our kids, but real consensus will require honoring traditional values, not just progressive enthusiasms. If SEL winds up hijacked by well-meaning ideologues, a promising cause will morph into a divisive educational culture war.
President Trump is finally putting a team in place that could begin to address the grave and growing security threats right here in our hemisphere. The corrupt narco state in Venezuela, the explosion of coca in Colombia, and the attack on democratic institutions in Central America by narco kingpins and gangs. They're even backing the election of an anti-American candidate in Mexico. Imagine another failed state like Venezuela right on our doorstep. As Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo can form a diplomatic team of experienced and loyal political appointees who can lead and manage career diplomats to confront threats rather than kick the can down the road. They should press for an urgent transition in Venezuela, rallying the region to sanction the Maduro regime and support democratic opposition. And they must help Colombia's next president confront the persistent narco-terrorist threat. And they should reassure Mexico that the United States will be a reliable partner, growing together economically and tending to common security threats. The new foreign policy team must begin to take care of business right here in our neighborhood.
The outcry to regulate big tech companies is getting louder. There are several questions. One is, should sites like Facebook be held accountable for their site's content? Yes, by their customers. Customers know more about the good and bad of the content than do government regulators. And government regulators have their own agendas and biases. So we should proceed cautiously before regulating content. Should government limit big tech's collection and use of big data? This question should become moot after a few years, as blockchain is likely to give customers control of their data. Between now and then, the best thing to do for customers is provide them with transparency. Should the government break up big tech? That makes no practical sense. Which of your friends do you want kicked off of Facebook? Do you want your Google searches diverted to ask.com or your Amazon purchases diverted to Walmart? If the government did break up one or more companies, customer choice would put them back together. What's the bottom line? In fast-moving markets, customers and competition are the best regulators.
Across the nation, proof that education reforms are working has come from record graduation rates. But in DC, the unbelievable progress is just that. After posting a record 73% grad rate last year, an audit found 1 in 3 DC grads received diplomas in violation of policy. Excessive absences were one problem. Nearly a third of graduates missed 50 days in their final year. Another was credit recovery, which offered easy makeup classes to students who never took the original courses. All told, if DC had followed policy, its grad rate would have fallen below 50%. So is DC an outlier or the canary in the coal mine? Well, under similar pressure for results, grad rate issues surfaced in Maryland, Chicago, LA, New York, and elsewhere. Look, everyone wants more students to graduate. These shortcuts aren't the answer. They make it hard for us to tell which districts are actually pushing more students to earn diplomas. DC is a lesson that we can't improve the lives of students or school systems unless school leaders push our students to new heights rather than just pretending to.
Some people worry that big tech companies are seducing you into spending more time online, all so they can monetize your data. Is this true? Well, yes, but not in a bad way. Big tech companies do try to get you to consume more of their services, just like Starbucks and the New York Times do. This is normal. Is consuming more tech bad for you? Studies show that spending more time on Facebook is associated with greater obesity, less well-being, and less real time with friends. But this is also true for television. And if you interact with your friends on Facebook, your sense of well-being is actually higher and you feel more socially connected. But don't the tech companies gather lots of data on you that they use to their advantage? Absolutely. But this is also normal. President Obama made social media micro-targeting of voters famous. Tech companies just need to be transparent about their real business. Big tech is doing what others have done before, only in a bigger way. And big tech successors will do it even bigger.
87% of Americans think it's appropriate to require physically able people to seek work in order to receive public benefits, and generally, most government aid recipients do. Yet critics call work requirements for safety net programs cruel, believing they punish people for being poor. The truth is, work requirements are not punishment. They ensure that people who are capable of work stay connected to the labor market. Most states do this with people receiving unemployment compensation, and they should be doing it with safety net programs too. Requiring work sends a clear message that if you can work, you should be working, while government assistance is there to support you. It also fulfills a kind of social contract that most poor people agree with. In a poll conducted in 2016, 8 of 10 Americans in poverty agreed with work requirements. Most of all, work requirements improve the integrity of our safety net programs. Anti-poverty programs do much better when they are perceived as a way to help people move out of poverty through work, rather than simply a means to make unemployment more tolerable.
The nation just got its report card, and the marks aren't great. NAEP is the only test that allows you to compare scores across states, demographics, and over time. And as the best indicator of our students' performance, it's often called the nation's report card. Recently released 2017 NAEP results show that 4th and 8th graders' math and reading scores were mostly flat. That doesn't sound so bad, but after a peak in 2013, reading and math scores dipped in 2015, for the first time ever, after 2 decades of steady gains. The latest results confirm that our progress has stalled. But the details add to the story. The scores of the poorest performing students were lower this year than in 2015, and high performers' scores were even higher, meaning the gap between them is growing, leaving our most challenged students further behind. Though concerning, these scores can't tell us why performance is flat, and anyone using them to do so is selling something. But like any report card, NAEP can serve as a wake-up call that there's plenty of hard work ahead.
Some people argue that large tech companies are too big. They are indeed large. Facebook has more active users than are people in China. Google handles at least 2 trillion searches a year. Why are these companies so big? Because you and I use them. We do that because we get lots of value, so saying they're too big is to say they provide too much value, which doesn't make sense. Other people argue that big tech makes too much money. Facebook's 2017 profit was $16 billion, about 40% of its revenue. Does Facebook really need that much money? That's the wrong question. Only about 10 to 20% of tech firms ever make a profit. So 80 to 90% either break even or lose substantial amounts of money. The profits of the few drive investors to endure the losses of the many. On average, the tech sector's returns are comparable to those of the S&P 500. So when someone says that tech companies are too big, say you're grateful. You're getting great value and competition for the future.
Will the upcoming North-South Summit at Panmunjom usher in a new era of Korean peace and denuclearization? Seoul's sunshine or engagement-oriented government certainly seems to think so. And there are many in America and elsewhere who seem to agree, including even President Donald Trump, at least from time to time. But let's not break out the champagne just yet. The first 2 North-South summits, in 2000 and 2007, were flat-out failures, at least for the West. Despite sunshine promises and predictions at the time, they led neither to denuclearization nor to peace. Why exactly should we think a 3rd summit with a 3rd ruler of the Kim family regime will turn out differently? True peace with the South would require Pyongyang to recognize the right of the South Korean state to exist. True denuclearization would force the Kim family regime to give up its quest for unconditional unification of the whole peninsula. The real existing North Korean state cannot accept either of these propositions. Seoul's illusions, therefore, look to be on a collision course with reality, and maybe Washington's too. Stay tuned.
Vladimir Putin has set Russia on a collision course with America and the West. Putin sees Russians as heirs to a vast empire, an empire they lost with the fall of the Soviet Union. And the biggest obstacle to their restored greatness? The United States. So, Putin seeks to regain control of former Soviet states. He wants to create a world in which the US is just another country, rather than a global leader. To that end, he's driving a narrative that says, if the US was just cut down to size, Russia could regain its empire and once again be the defender of Europe and Christianity. In pursuit of his vision, Putin is creating a Hobbesian world of violence and lawlessness. His seizure of Crimea was illegal. His occupation of eastern Ukraine, again, illegal. Interference in US elections, illegal. Cyber attacks on Baltic countries, aggression. Deliberately bombing hospitals in Syria, that's a war crime. But Putin's Russia isn't the Soviet Union. Its economy is the size of Australia's. Its population is shrinking. We can resist Putin's aggression, and we must. To learn more about my take on Russia, check the link to the book Rise of the Revisionists in the description below.
Is this too much? Gallup has been tracking American attitudes on global warming for more than 2 decades. In 1997, 48% nationally said that the effects of global warming had already begun. In Gallup's new March poll, 60% gave that response. Just 12% said that the effects would never happen. However, a majority in Gallup's new poll did not believe global warming would pose a serious threat to them during their lifetimes. That may be one reason why the issue ranks low when pollsters ask about top priorities for the President and Congress. In a January Pew survey, 46% said that global climate change should be a top priority. Of the 19 issues Pew asked about, climate change tied for second to last place. More people, 62%, said that protecting the environment should be a top priority. Terrorism outstripped both as a top priority at 73%. In Gallup's polling, the public worries more about environmental problems they can see in their own communities, such as the pollution of drinking water, than they worry about climate change.
China is the world's last remaining empire. Today, China is powerful enough to expand its imperial holdings and establish itself as the middle kingdom in Asia, as it was for most of its history. Its current leader, Xi Jinping, sees himself as a modern-day emperor. Under Xi, China will try to expand its maritime and territorial claims in the South and East China Seas and coerce Taiwan, the last holdout to Chinese so-called reunification. It will challenge U.S. primacy and the American-led security system in the Indo-Pacific. Given Chinese increased power and prestige, its ambitions are only growing. Xi believes he can achieve the long-held goal of national rejuvenation. Washington needs to establish a strategy that pushes back on Chinese expansionism and strengthens alliances with Asian partners. The goal of this strategy should be to force China to choose between expensive imperial expansionism or badly needed socioeconomic reform. To learn more about my take on Chinese imperialism, check the links to the book Rise of the Revisionists in the description below.
This spring has seen the first statewide teacher strikes in recent memory. Teachers have a legitimate complaint. For college-educated professionals, their pay in many states is mediocre and has declined nationally by 2% in real terms between 1992 and 2014. But the notion that taxpayers are defunding schools is just wrong. Even as teacher salaries fell across the land during that period, inflation-adjusted per-pupil spending grew by 27%. But much of this funding has gone to non-instructional costs. While student enrollment was up 20% over that 22-year period, non-teaching staff was up by more than twice that, 47%. Teacher benefits are also more generous than those of the taxpayers who pay for them. School teachers receive more than 3 times the retirement benefits per hour of work than the average civilian employee. Look, there's a deal to be struck here. But if teachers want sustainable pay increases, school spending needs to be tackled in a way that addresses the concerns of teachers, students, and taxpayers.
The oldest division in the Muslim world is the Sunni-Shiite split. Downplaying its ecumenical approach towards spreading the Islamic Revolution, Tehran has now embraced Shiite supremacy. And Sunnis and Shiites from Lebanon to Afghanistan, Syria to Yemen are nearly equal in number. Iran has tens of thousands of foreign Shiites under the command of the Revolutionary Guards. Never in modern history have we seen a Muslim state, not the pan-Arabists of yesteryear or the ever-proselytizing Saudis, deploy such expeditionary forces into battle. Iranian Islamist imperialism, backed up by the ambitions and firepower of Vladimir Putin's Russia, now dominates the northern Middle East. It's only a matter of time before Tehran aims its convulsive intentions towards the Shiites of Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. United Nations conventional arms restrictions against Iran come off in 2020. The nuclear deal's restraints start falling in 2023. An Iranian Islamist hegemon is rising, and the United States is just watching. For a deeper understanding of the Iranian clerical regime's quest to dominate the Middle East, see the link to the book, The Rise of the Revisionists, in the description below.
Senator Bernie Sanders wants the federal government to provide a $15 per hour job to every American who wants one. It's hard to overstate how silly this proposal is. Taxes could never be raised, and existing programs could never be cut enough to finance this policy at the level required. And the government could not possibly come up with enough jobs to satisfy its obligations under this plan. This cartoonish proposal is predicated in part on the notion that there are bad jobs, jobs that are beneath the dignity of what a reasonable person should expect from employment. It's true, of course, that many jobs are physically demanding and pay relatively little, but it's also true that work confers dignity and is virtuous. Flipping burgers for $10 an hour isn't a bad job. It's an opportunity to build skills and climb the employment ladder. It's an opportunity to provide for yourself and your family. It's an opportunity to make a contribution to your community and to society. All leaders should encourage work. Leaders shouldn't denigrate, even unintentionally, the jobs held by millions of hardworking Americans. That message is counterproductive. Messages matter.
Trade wars are a tricky business, even when you think your partners aren't playing fair. In a March poll, only 13% of American adults thought that China had a fair trade policy with the United States, while 43% called it unfair. By a margin of 44 to 23%, respondents to a different question felt that the U.S. would be hurt more by a trade war than China would be. In another March poll, 28% of registered voters agreed with President Trump's assertion that a trade war would be good for the United States and easily won. 64% disagreed. In our polarized political climate, 67% of Republicans, but only 7% of Democrats thought it would be good for us. The polls produced conflicting impressions of support and opposition to the aluminum and steel tariffs themselves. But several new ones, including an April ABC News Washington Post poll, show that more people think the situation would be bad for jobs than good, by 49 to 36%.
The results of the national elections in Iraq were shocking, but they weren't necessarily surprising. Less than 45% of eligible voters cast a ballot. Most didn't vote at all because they were frustrated with the current crop of leaders who've consistently failed to improve their lives. This explains why Muqtada Sadr's Sairun coalition appears to have won a narrow plurality. Sadr has cultivated his status as an arch-Iraqi nationalist and the champion of average Iraqis. Even still, Sadr didn't win by much, so his ability to determine the governing coalition, let alone dictate and dominate it, is going to be very limited. Prime Minister Abadi could easily retain power as a compromise candidate, or the Iranians might squeeze the various Shia parties until they agree to Tehran's preferred candidate, as they eventually did back in 2010. But for my money, the most important question is not who becomes prime minister right now. It's what happens when the government fails to deliver better governance. Because it's all too likely that they will fail, especially since the United States seems uninterested in providing the help and guidance that would be needed for them to succeed.
In an era marked by heated claims of media bias, journalists need to ensure that news coverage is independent and impartial. Education, the field I know best, is one where it should be easy to meet this bar. To see where things stand, two colleagues and I analyzed major media news coverage of federal education in 2009 and 2017. In 2017, Republicans controlled the federal government and proposed major new reforms. Back in 2009, the same was true of Democrats. In 2017, news stories on Republican proposals featured a negative slant nearly half the time. On the other hand, in 2009, coverage of Obama's proposals tilted negative less than 5% of the time. This kind of thing might fly on the editorial pages, but unless one thinks that Democrats have a monopoly on educational wisdom, such reporting marks an abject professional failure. And if journalists can't even report impartially on education, it's scary to contemplate how they approach more polarizing questions.
America has celebrated Memorial Day for at least 150 years. It's a post-Civil War holiday that used to be called Decoration Day. The name morphed over time as the holiday grew post-World War I to commemorate all who have died in service to the country. Remembering our fallen soldiers is more than nostalgia. It's about re-engaging with the principles that define America. Because Memorial Day renews the memory of those who gave their lives that this nation might live, it reminds us that our nation is dedicated to liberty and equality. Our national cemeteries at Arlington and elsewhere make it a point to specify the individual names of fallen soldiers on those rows on rows of headstones, to recognize the equal worthiness of each of its dead soldiers to be remembered by name. Not all democracies have done this. In ancient Athens, dead soldiers were nameless because it was only the city of Athens that was meant to be remembered. It matters how a government thinks of and treats its military dead, because it reveals how it thinks about citizens and government.
Students across the land are wrapping up annual state tests. For all the backlash these tests spark, they exist mostly in response to a sensible expectation that parents know how their schools are doing. We should neither abandon testing nor ignore its problems, but ensure that it's used responsibly. Here are 4 thoughts on how to do just that. First, reading and math scores can go up or down for lots of reasons. Why scores go up matters as much as whether they do. Second, when a focus on reading and math tests shifts time away from other important learning, we need to weigh the costs and benefits. Third, reading and math tests capture only a narrow slice of what schools are asked to do. That matters. Fourth, today's state tests don't provide meaningful immediate feedback. It's hard to blame families for doubting the value of tests, which are more useful for grading schools than for educating kids. Look, testing is a valuable tool, but like any tool, it's only effective when it's used well.
In the U.S., there are about 2,500 child fatalities annually due to abuse or neglect by a parent or caregiver. In about half of those cases, child welfare agencies were aware of the neglect and abuse beforehand. How can these cases be stopped from falling through the cracks? Allegheny County, Pennsylvania might hold the key. They use predictive risk modeling to target potentially dangerous family situations and help vulnerable kids before it's too late. With predictive risk modeling, different arms of local government, like schools, hospitals, and welfare agencies, collect routine information about the kids they see. They share that information with other agencies, and that information gets plugged into an algorithm and adds up to a risk score. These scores help child service agencies identify which cases need to be investigated most urgently. This isn't about seizing children from their parents. Removing kids from their homes is a last resort. Importantly, predictive risk modeling can help determine which homes need assistance from local agencies and prevent abuse and neglect before they happen. If local governments are smart and committed, they can use this technology to save kids' lives.
There is one simple fact that has yet to penetrate very deeply into the policy world. Our economic future, like that of other nations of the world, depends directly on the quality of our workers. More specifically, in this increasingly technological age, the cognitive skills of future workers will determine much of our economic well-being. Given that simple fact, the backlash against testing in schools and against accountability for results is a bit scary. From international testing in math, we find that U.S. students rank 39th in the world, putting us below the average for developed countries and having us competing with Croatia and Greece. You might ask, isn't our economy still the envy of the world? And the answer is yes for now, but not necessarily in the future. We have been able to benefit from good economic institutions with limited government intrusion, with more schooling than elsewhere, and with high-skilled immigrants. But the future strength of each is in doubt, and we will have to rely on the skills of our population for ongoing success.